Just several days ago, the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group steamed into the Caribbean. In the warm waters between Cuba and Venezuela, the United States is assembling the largest naval force the region has seen since the 1989 invasion of Panama. More than 10,000 US troops are already in the theater. Old bases like Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico have been brought back to life, now hosting F-35 squadrons and MQ-9 Reaper drones. Alongside the carrier group, at least 8 additional warships patrol the area, including the Aegis destroyers USS Gravely and USS Jason Dunham, as well as the Iwo Jima amphibious ready group carrying 2,200 Marines poised for combat. P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft circle off Venezuela's coast. The MV Ocean Trader as special operations support ship has slipped into the region. Strategic B-52s and B-1s fly demonstrative runs along Venezuela's borders. Washington isn't just flexing its muscles, it is throwing punches. Since September 2nd, US forces have struck 16 vessels in the Caribbean, which Washington claims were ferrying narcotics from Venezuela to the United States. 67 people have been killed in these engagements. Officially, this is a campaign against narco-traficantes. In practice, the drug trade is a pretext. The real objective is far more political: the removal of Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. In a world that is more connected than ever, speaking a foreign language is no longer just a nice skill. It is a real advantage. It helps you travel freely, work across cultures, and understand the world from a wider perspective. The problem? Traditional language learning often takes too long and kills motivation along the way. That is where Speakly changes the game. The app helps you start speaking confidently several times faster than with old-fashioned methods. Instead of memorizing random words, Speakly teaches you what you actually use in everyday conversations. Plus, you get your own AI language coach available 24/7, like a private tutor who is always there when you need help. Learning feels fun and engaging, with listening and writing exercises, practical speaking tasks, and even music recommendations. And the best part? You can get a lifetime plan, one payment for unlimited language learning, forever. Click the link in the description to check it out. Venezuela burst onto global front pages on September the 2nd, when President Donald Trump released a video showing a Venezuelan vessel being destroyed by the US Navy. According to Trump, the boat was being used by members of the Trendarangua gang to smuggle narcotics. Since then, similar strikes have multiplied, and Washington has begun amassing increasingly substantial military assets across the Caribbean. The Trump administration, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio included, has forcefully defended these actions, branding them a war on, quote, narco-terrorists. The choice of the word terrorist is no accident. It is central to a broader strategy the administration has adopted toward Venezuela. But to understand that strategy, we need to go back several months. In February 2025, the US government designated several Latin American gangs as foreign terrorist organizations, among them the now infamous Trendarangua. The move was unprecedented. Historically, the FTO list was reserved for ideologically or religiously motivated groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, not criminal syndicates. But the consequences of the designation are enormous. Travel bans, asset freezes, and most crucially, it empowers the president to use military force against such organizations without congressional authorization. The decision to designate Trendarangua as terrorist organization allowed the Trump administration to rewrite the rules of engagement in the Caribbean. Instead of intercepting drug boats, US forces began destroying them outright from the air. But that was only the beginning. the administration quickly turned the FTO designation into a legal foundation for something far more ambitious: a potential strike on Venezuela itself. How? The White House has begun claiming that the Trendarangua gang is directly linked to Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. In support of this narrative, the Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, is set to be added to the list of foreign terrorist organizations on November 24th. According to the Americans, this cartel is personally led by the Venezuelan president. The case is shaky at best. Even leaked US intelligence assessments cast doubt on any operational links between Maduro and Trendarangua. The same is true for the Cartel de los Soles. Many experts question whether it even exists in the centralized cartel form suggested by Washington, describing it instead as a loose web of corrupt officials and opportunistic smugglers, rather than a coherent criminal enterprise. The inconsistencies grow even starker when we look at the trafficking data itself. Trump argues that the destroyed vessels were laden with fentanyl and cocaine, but according to the US Drug Enforcement Administration, the fentanyl flooding America's streets is produced almost entirely in Mexico. Cocaine does transit through Venezuela, but the country is not a major producer. Colombia remains the dominant source, and Venezuela is not even the main corridor for shipments heading to the United States. According to DEA figures, roughly 74% of cocaine reaching the US travels along the Pacific route from Colombia and Ecuador. The Trump administration is aware of these nuances. It simply doesn't consider them relevant. The objective is not to wage a drug war, it is to remove Maduro. The current escalation should not come as a surprise. It springs from a deeply ingrained tradition in the US foreign policy, the belief that Washington enjoys special prerogatives in the Western Hemisphere. The foundation of that mindset is the Donroe Doctrine of 1823, originally aimed at preventing European colonial powers from meddling in Latin America. Over time, it evolved into a justification for US regional hegemony, most famously expressed through President Theodore Roosevelt's Big Stick diplomacy, which sanctioned the use of force to protect American interests and turned the Caribbean into what many saw as an quote, American inner lake. Trump's second term has been defined by a revival and a hardening of this worldview, which analysts in Washington have dubbed the quote, Donroe Doctrine, a fusion of Donald and Monroe. The doctrine blends traditional hemispheric hegemony with a sharply ideological anti-socialist agenda aimed at the so-called Troika of tyranny: Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Layered onto that is a new great power imperative, pushing China, Russia, and Iran out of what the administration describes as quote, America's own backyard. In this updated version, the Donroe Doctrine is no longer merely about deterring outside powers. It frames Latin America as an extension of the American homeland, a space where Washington can act unilaterally to eliminate actors it deems hostile. It is also important to remember that for Trump, Venezuela is more than just a doctrinal issue. It is personal. He already tried to remove Maduro once, back in 2019. At the time, Washington recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate interim president and imposed sweeping sanctions aimed at severing Maduro from the country's oil revenues. The goal was to spark either a popular uprising or a military coup that would topple the regime. But the plan failed. Venezuela's military elite remained largely loyal to Maduro, and the entire operation ended in diplomatic embarrassment for Washington. Returning to the White House for a second term, Trump appears determined to finish what he started, with far more radical tools. For months, the United States has been quietly massing military power on Venezuela's doorstep. The scale is unmatched in decades. Roughly 10,000 troops, 8 warships, F-35 fighter squadrons, MQ-9 Reaper drones, and B-52 and B-1 strategic bombers. The arrival of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group completed the picture. At the same time, the administration has launched a psychological campaign built on deliberate ambiguity. Trump oscillates wildly. One day he threatens, strikes on land, and declares that Maduro's days are numbered. The next day he publicly denies that he is considering an invasion. The aim of this strategy appears to be twofold: to sow paranoia within Maduro's inner circle, convincing him that the confrontation is inevitable, and to signal to the quote disillusioned elements of the regime that the time to defect has come. It is in this light that Trump's public announcement that he had authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations in Venezuela should be understood. Presidents almost never acknowledge such directives openly. This time Trump wanted the enemy to hear it. The goal is to ignite panic inside the Miraflores palace and trigger an internal witch hunt that could immobilize Maduro's regime from within. This sharp escalation was not the only option on the table. That it became policy is the result of an internal power struggle inside the Trump administration, one in which the Florida hawks ultimately prevailed. The chief architect of the current strategy is Marco Rubio. Holding both the post of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Rubio has amassed near total control over US foreign policy. As the son of Cuban immigrants, he has long viewed the downfall of leftist regimes in Havana, Caracas and Managua as a personal mission. He is backed by other Florida Republicans, a fact that is no coincidence. Florida is home to large and politically active exile communities from across Latin America, especially Cuba and Venezuela. This influential bloc harbors deep anti-communist and anti-authoritarian sentiments, and anti-Maduro attitudes among Florida Republicans are particularly intense. This dynamic sidelined an alternative diplomatic track led by Richard Grenell, a proponent of transactional deal-making. Grenell has been negotiating with Maduro on a potential arrangement. In exchange for avoiding a US intervention, the Venezuelan leader would grant American companies preferential access to the country's oil reserves and commit to reducing the presence of China, Russia and Iran. Trump publicly boasted about the offer, saying, quote, he, Maduro, offered everything. You know why? Because he doesn't want to mess with the United States. Yet in early October 2025, Trump ordered Grenell to halt all negotiations with Caracas. Rubio and the Florida hawks had prevailed. The exact reasons, as is often the case with Trump, remain opaque. Perhaps the president decided that televised footage of blown-up drug boats and tough talk aimed at the socialist dictator in Caracas would boost his domestic standing, after which he could always return to the negotiating table. But it is equally possible that Trump hardened his position because he genuinely intends to use military force and remove Maduro once and for all. For now, it is impossible to say which path Trump will ultimately choose. What is becoming increasingly clear, however, is that the drive toward confrontation with Venezuela is generating growing unease within America's own military machinery. In mid-October, Admiral Alvin Halsey, the commander of US Southern Command, responsible for all military operations in Latin America, abruptly announced his retirement after less than a year in the post. US media reports indicate that Halsey had raised concerns about the legality and risks of the new mission. He was also reportedly frustrated at being cut out of the decision-making loop regarding strikes on narco-trafficante vessels, responsibility for which had been handed over to US Special Operations Command. Maduro is preparing for the worst. The armed forces have been placed on maximum alert. The Bolivarian militia has been mobilized, and Caracas has reached out to China, Russia and Iran for military assistance. While Venezuela's military could not stop a full-scale American invasion, it still possesses enough strike capabilities to pose real dangers to US forces in the opening stages of any conflict. Foremost among those are Venezuela's fleet of 21 Su-30 fighter jets, capable of carrying Russian Ha-31 supersonic anti-ship missiles. The US Navy must also contend with Iran-supplied CM-90 anti-ship missiles with a range of roughly 90 kilometers. It is worth noting that despite mounting US pressure, Maduro's regime shows no signs of fracturing. As political scientist Javier Corrales argues, the durability of the system has little to do with public legitimacy, and everything to do with what he calls, quote, a fusion of functions. Venezuela's elite, senior military officers, judges, politicians has been granted access to lucrative economic ventures, both legal, such as state contracts, and illicit. They have become, in effect, shareholders in the regime, profiting from drug trafficking, illegal gold mining, and fuel smuggling. For them, a transition to a pro-American opposition government would not merely threaten their wealth, it would almost certainly mean extradition and prosecution in the United States, where many of them, Maduro included, already face federal indictments. And so, as the USS Gerald R. Ford takes up position at the gates of America's backyard, analysts in Washington are asking the same question: how does this end? The hawks in Trump's administration are clearly hoping for a replay of Operation Just Cause, the lightning-fast 1989 invasion of Panama that toppled Manuel Noriega, another dictator accused of drug trafficking. But that analogy is both false and dangerous. Venezuela is not Panama. It is 12 times larger, with 10 times the population and, critically, without US military bases on its soil. Even the 10,000 American troops currently deployed in the Caribbean are far too few to contemplate a just cause style operation. Analysts at CSIS estimate that such an invasion would require anywhere from 50,000 to as many as 200,000 US troops. So what are the plausible endgame scenarios? What can President Trump actually do? The first option, and the one Trump appears to want most, is a psychological victory. Faced with overwhelming US military pressure, Maduro's inner circle cracks, or a coup replaces him with a government more prepared to deal with Washington. As noted earlier, this outcome is quite unlikely. There is simply no evidence of fractures within Maduro's power structure. The second option is a set of limited strikes on land-based targets. The Pentagon already has target lists prepared. The risk, however, is obvious. Rather than break the regime, such strikes could rally it, allowing Maduro to consolidate power under the banner of defending national sovereignty. The third scenario, and the riskiest, is a special operations raid. Analysts have speculated about a Delta Force or Navy SEAL mission to capture or kill Maduro. Such an operation would carry extreme danger. A failure, American commandos captured and paraded on Venezuelan television, would be a political catastrophe for Trump and humiliation on the scale of the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Yet the greatest risk of this high-stakes gamble may not be failure at all, but paradoxically, success. Sources in Washington acknowledge that the administration has spent far more time planning potential strikes than envisioning the, quote, day after Maduro. Some experts warn that if Maduro is removed by force and the state apparatus collapses, Venezuela could descend into Libya-style chaos. Local warlords, criminal syndicates, and Colombian paramilitary groups already operating inside the country could fill the vacuum. At this point, the most likely path appears to be the second scenario: limited US strikes on military targets inside Venezuela. But given Trump's personal vendetta against Maduro, magnified by the president's own temperament, events could escalate quickly, and every option remains on the table. Predicting Trump's next move is especially difficult because even he may not know it. His Venezuela policy is riven by contradiction. In July 2025, at the very moment the Pentagon was finalizing its Caribbean deployments, the administration quietly renewed Chevron's license, allowing the US oil giant not only to continue, but to expand its operations in Venezuela. So, on one hand, the president threatens to bomb the country. On the other, he authorizes America's largest energy corporation to invest billions there, putting its assets and personnel at direct risk. It is a vivid illustration of the internal incoherence of White House policy. Trump is pursuing two mutually exclusive strategies at once. The first of Trump's two competing policies is an ideological crusade for regime change, driven by the Florida faction under Marco Rubio, an effort to forcibly uproot left-wing autocracies from the Western Hemisphere in the worst tradition of the Donroe Doctrine. The second is a blunt transactional realism focused on securing natural resources and blocking China's expansion. Beijing would gladly snap up Chevron's contracts if the company withdrew. For Trump, Chevron is both a hostage in his confrontation with Maduro and an insurance policy for the future. It is like a foot wedged in the door if the regime collapses, and a safeguard if Maduro survives, allowing Trump to abandon the crusade at any moment and return to the negotiations he himself previously torpedoed. Still, we should acknowledge that oil may be mostly a red herring, something Luke Skiba has argued in his X post. Yes, Venezuela has the world's biggest oil resources, but 80 to 90% of them are ultra-heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, thick, difficult to extract and dependent on imported diluents and a stable power grid, something the shattered country lacks. That is why production collapsed from 400 million barrels per day in the 1970s to under 400,000 in 2020, recovering only thanks to Iranian condensate and Chevron's return. And although US Gulf Coast refineries value heavy grades, the global shortage of such oil does not change the essential fact. A rapid rebound in Venezuelan output is unrealistic. According to the Baker Institute, a return to 3 million barrels per day would require a decade and billions of dollars in annual investment. If oil matters in this story, it is only to prevent China from claiming it by default, and not because Washington expects a quick bonanza from Venezuelan fields. And so as the USS Gerald R. Ford sails into the Caribbean, no one, neither in Caracas nor Washington, and perhaps not even inside the White House, truly knows the ultimate purpose of this formidable armada. Is it the prelude to an invasion, a tool to trigger a coup, or merely the most expensive bluff in the history of American gunboat diplomacy?